Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Nathan Cofnas. Hello, Nathan. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
I'm elated to be speaking to you, Nathan. So, Nathan, some years ago, you became quite the celebrity when you decided to criticize Kevin McDonald's argument, Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. Nathan, give us a brief summary, not of your critique, but of Kevin's thesis.
Kevin McDonald argues that Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy, that Jews have a suite of genetic adaptations and cultural practices that lead them to undermine their host societies, Gentile societies, for their own benefit. And the genetic adaptations include things like high intelligence and ethnocentrism. And McDonald argues that modern liberalism was a creation of liberal multiculturalism, was a creation of highly ethnocentric, intelligent Jewish intellectuals who sought to destabilize Gentile society, impose diversity and multiracialism on Gentile society while preserving separatism and racial purity for Jews. And he says Jews were a necessary condition for the triumph of liberal multiculturalism in the West.
All right. But Nathan, what are some of your objections to McDonald's thesis?
Well, there's a superficial appeal to his theory, which is that if you look at many of the leading leftist intellectuals who played important roles in this ideology, they were Jewish. So that seems to warrant further investigation. Could there be something to what McDonald is saying? Now, he investigates Jewish intellectuals like Franz Boas, Sigmund Freud, the Frankfurt School theorists, and he claims to find evidence that they were highly motivated by their Jewishness and Jewish interests. I suggest that the obvious alternative hypothesis for what we observe, namely Jewish overrepresentation in liberal movements, is Jews are just highly intelligent, and largely because of that, they're overrepresented in all cognitively demanding activities, except those which are overtly anti-Semitic, which won't tolerate Jews or allow Jews to rise to the top of to participate in that activity. So Jews are overrepresented in science and math and chess and literature and in political movements, but less well represented among right-wing movements because right-wing movements have been more anti-Semitic in recent history. But even political movements that aren't really on the left, like libertarianism, are essentially just as dominated by Jews, it seems, because there isn't much anti-Semitism to stop them. So I analyzed McDonald's evidence, purporting to show that people like Franz Boas and the Frankfurt School theorists were secretly motivated by Jewish interests. And I found that in most cases, there really was no evidence. McDonald just makes insinuations based on the fact that they said that they were concerned about the Holocaust or something like that. But most of these intellectuals supported liberal multiculturalism for Jews and Israel just as much as they did for Gentiles and Western countries. So I think the parsimonious explanation for Jewish overrepresentation in liberal intellectual movements is Jews are just overrepresented in all cognitively demanding, non-anti-Semitic, cognitively demanding activities.
And you refer to your response as the default hypothesis. Please tell us a little bit more. Please tell us a little about it.
Well, I call it the default hypothesis because as a matter of logic, it's more parsimonious than Mcdonald's thesis. Mcdonald agrees that Jews are overrepresented in intellectually demanding activities like math and so on because of intelligence. So he agrees that intelligence explains some important aspects of Jewish behavior. And so the parsimonious hypothesis is that the same factor explains Jewish overrepresentation everywhere. So some people have objected to me calling it the default hypothesis because they say that is tendentious, suggests that my hypothesis should, well, be the default, as it says. But that calling it the default hypothesis doesn't mean Mcdonald can't be right. Sometimes the interesting hypotheses turn out to be true that weren't the default hypothesis. But I argue that the evidence, in fact, in this case, does favor the default hypothesis.
All right, Nathan, but what about Asians? Asians score quite high on IQ tests, but they're not overrepresented in politics or intellectual movements. And in a previous conversation, I noted that Jews will do well in non-Western societies, but in a non-Western society that is not underpinned by trust and individualism, they may not do as well. So do you account for the role of personality in explaining the success of Jewish people?
Yeah, well, the default hypothesis in my original paper, I suggested two main factors. The most important is intelligence. Jews are something like average IQ, something like 110, 112. And also their concentration in influential urban areas in recent history, which I thought was a secondary factor, but still important. And Asians are completely different. I mean, their cognitive psychological profile really makes a comparison with Jews and whites not very straightforward. And their intelligence is more visuospatial, so they're especially overrepresented in sciences, math and sciences. The default hypothesis wasn't meant to be a unified theory for all of sociology. There are many other factors, and also, more significant cultural barriers that might prevent Asians from participating in certain activities. And I mean, obviously, personality differences. There's clearly, some differences in personality, but I haven't emphasized that very much in my published work on this because it's just not very well understood. And so I would come across as a kind of phrenologist just speculating about, the role of personality differences, but I'm sure that is an important factor.
Well, point of correction, Nathan, personality differences are well understood. Maybe we should do more research to compare the personality of Jewish people to non-Jewish people.
I meant race differences in personality.
Yeah, we do have sufficient data comparing Easterners to Westerners. But we're Jewish people.
Yeah, I'm not Jews compared to whites, though.
No,
as far as I know.
But I don't think that it would be silly to include personality differences in your research. I'm reading, well, I'm not reading it now. I read it already. You produced an article sometime ago titled Judaism as a Group Evolutionary Strategy. You were critiquing Kevin McDonald, and in the piece you refer to Karl Marx and George Soros. And let me read a snippet. The most influential Jewish radical in history, Karl Marx held extremely anti-Jewish views. The most influential Jewish radical alive when The Culture of Critique was published, and still to this day, is Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is mentioned one time in The Culture of Critique, in an ended note where MacDonald comments simply that he could be regarded as someone whose writings were not highly influenced by Jewish identity and specifically Jewish interests. Okay, so do these examples vitiate the thesis promulgated by MacDonald?
Uh, well, vitiate.
Yeah, because
Uh, it,
some see this
I
as a major blowback, a major takedown of MacDonald.
I don't think that. I mean, and it's very rare in science, and especially social science, for a thesis to stand or fall by one particular piece of evidence. Um, so that doesn't completely undermine McDonald's theory, but I think those are important counterexamples, um, especially since actually McDonald uh, says that Karl Marx um, held that Judaism would continue to survive after the socialist revolution, and he quotes a book uh, giving a reference for this claim. And as I pointed out in the paper, uh, the quote that he was referring to doesn't exist. And McDonald has acknowledged that he got it wrong, that he accidentally made up a Marx quote. So McDonald thought that there was evidence that Marx was concerned with Jewish interests and planned on preserving Jewish group continuity. So McDonald thought that was important. It turns out that he made it up, and Marx never said that, and in fact said the opposite, and thought that that Jews would cease to exist as a separate people when the conditions for huckstering no longer obtained.
All right, and you can comment briefly now on Soros, and then I'll provide a response.
And Soros, probably the most influential Jewish philanthropist, has no interest in Jewish causes. His money goes to essentially, and in many cases, to anti-Semites who are opposed to Israel, opposed to any kind of Jewish interests. So that doesn't prove McDonald is thesis is wrong, but the fact that he ignores cases like this and just cherry picks some cases that he claimed that might seem to support his theory suggests that he is engaged in cherry picking.
Okay, so my response is quite simple. The fact that Jews are highly intelligent, then obviously some of them will support more ethnocentric causes and others will not because they're highly intelligent people. So the pendulum may swing either way. But Andrew Joyce, in a critique of your work, and he cites scholars, he argues that Karl Marx actually wanted to recreate a new form of Judaism separate and apart from the ethos of capitalism. So, in that sense, Karl Marx was quite closer to the broader objectives of Jews wanting to undermine society. The difference, however, at the time was that Marx had a problem with the type with Judaism based on which was practiced, but intrinsically he was a Jew and also ethnocentric. This is an argument made by Andrew Joyce in a series of articles published in March 2021.
But you're saying that it was about Marx?
Yeah, yes. So Andrew Joyce, he published.
I don't know. Andrew Joyce just makes things up. He makes up sources. So I mean, I would have to look at the argument. But Marx said that. I mean, he said things that everyone acknowledges is, including Mcdonald, acknowledges is anti-Semitic, and I mean, Marx said that he looks forward to the time when Jews no longer exist as a separate population. So if Andrew Joyce has discovered some secret evidence unknown to other people, I'll be happy to see that. But my default hypothesis when it comes to Andrew Joyce is that he's making it up like usual.
All right, then. Well, I've only read him. I've never met him before in real life, but personally and as well on this show, I never impugn intentions or motive to other people. But he obviously you
I
have
don't
admired.
know. It's
You may go
whatever his
ahead.
intentions, he says things that aren't correct, that are objectively and demonstrably incorrect. So, and especially when it comes to representing sources. I mean, like, just to give an example, he wrote an article criticizing my last paper, and he said that that there's no Jew on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association, and then he linked to a source where one of the people who was on the NRA's board described himself as a Jewish redneck, and there were other Jews also. He just and then when I confronted him about that, and he still wouldn't admit that he's wrong. So anyway, that's Andrew Joyce.
Okay, all right then. And also in your work on Judaism, because we're talking about Joyce and I've read his pieces, in your work on Judaism, you also critique the notion that Jews are overly and anti-immigration. And Joyce, again, in one of his articles, notes that in the most well, when he compared the more popular anti-immigration organization, a small percentage of Jewish people were in senior positions. He puts the figure at a little over 5%. But more broadly, Jews were underrepresented in the lesser known organizations, and these organizations were quite abundant. So this is one critique in response to your thesis that Jews are not overly anti-immigration.
Well, immigration is a quite complicated topic because one of Mcdonald's claims is that Jews were responsible for mass immigration to the United States, responsible for the 1965 Immigration Act that led to mass migration, multiracial migration. And McDonald says that the Jews who were behind the 1965 Immigration Act intended to turn whites into a minority for their own benefit. Now, in my paper, a recent paper called The Anti-Jewish Narrative, I examine the evidence for this, which is quite complicated. So if people want the details, they can look at that. But all commentators, mainstream commentators who have investigated the history of the 1965 Immigration Act think that the authors of the act didn't anticipate its consequences. The 1965 Act introduced the possibility of chain migration, and people like Sellers and so on just didn't know what, they had no experience with that. They didn't know what the consequences would be. They thought that the demographics of America would remain the same, and they intended it as a symbolic statement that they were not discriminating against people. But they didn't intend to turn whites into a minority. Now, later, making whites into a minority did become a goal of mainstream liberalism, but originally that was not the case. You know, the elites in really the conservative elites and the liberal elites have been pretty much on the same page with respect to immigration for the last couple decades. And the Republican Party and business interests have favored immigration just as much as liberals until Trump. Now, it's interesting that in Trump's administration, the main opponent of immigration was Stephen Miller, who was of course Jewish. So you could argue that possibly the most influential anti-immigration advocate in the last several years was Stephen Miller. You know, I would have to look at these other organizations that Joyce says Jews are underrepresented in. There is, you know, among conservatives who are against immigration, there is some anti-Semitism in some cases. Some, you know, especially groups that are either white nationalist or explicitly or implicitly white nationalists. There's often anti-Semitism, so you wouldn't expect Jews to be as overrepresented. But I mean, it's true that, you know, Jews are not exactly the same as white Gentiles. I don't claim that they're exactly the same as white Gentiles with urban white Gentiles with IQs of 110. So and it's possible that there could be other cultural reasons that push Jews toward to support immigration even more than would be expected given their position as elites. But the important point for Mcdonald is he claims Jews were responsible for mass immigration. They did it in order to turn America into a minority white country, and the evidence for that is irrelevant to whether Jews are currently overrepresented in anti-immigration groups.
All right. And another argument is that Jews promote immigration for the West, but they do not do so for Israel. And I also read your paper, The Anti-Jewish Narrative. So shed some light on this topic.
Well, many of the Jewish radicals who Mcdonald says holds up as supporting his thesis, they promoted exactly the same policies for America and Gentiles, America as for Israel. Many of them are anti-Israel, didn't want Israel to exist, or they wanted open borders for Israel, like Marcuse is an example. Exactly the same arguments, you know, Israel can't survive as just a homogeneous Jewish state. They need diversity. Liberal Jews in America have pushed for multiracial immigration to Israel, which sometimes takes the form of recognizing non-whites' claims to be Jewish, although they are not actually have no genetic relation with other Jewish populations, and their status as Jews under Jewish law is quite controversial. Mcdonald repeatedly claims that immigration to Israel is restricted to Jews, which isn't true. He knows it's not true. He continues saying it. Well, in Israel, you can you and your entire family can immigrate to Israel if you have one Jewish grandparent. So you're a quarter Jewish. If your uh, father's father is Jewish, and you you're not racially Jewish, you're a quarter Jewish, you're not Jewish according to Jewish law. Now you and your non-Jewish spouse and your non-Jewish children can all come to Israel, and hundreds of thousands of people have immigrated to Israel under these rules who are not considered Jewish. And there's some evidence that the majority of immigrants to Israel in the last several years are not halakhically Jewish. So, I mean, Israel, it doesn't have open borders, but there's they're certainly experiencing, diversity and multiracial immigration, and that was influenced by Jewish activism by liberal Jews in America.
Uh, all right then. But how would you explain the backlash against the immigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 90s and even the 21st century?
Explain the backlash. I mean,
Yeah,
some
they weren't not
Israel.
they weren't necessarily accepted with open arms.
That's true, but the question was, are Jews hypocritically advocating multiracial immigration to the U.S. But not to Israel? And I think the answer to that is liberal Jews in America pushed for multiracial immigration to America and for Israel. Now, that multiracial immigration can create challenges for Israel just as it does for America. So I don't think that's a surprise.
Well, personally, Nathan, I think the issue is quite simple. Jewish people are like people elsewhere. There will be Jews who are on the right, Jews who are on the left, and some who are overly in favor of multiculturalism. If Jews score higher than other groups on verbal intelligence and even mathematical intelligence, then we should expect Jews to be disproportionately represented in groups irrespective of the ideology. I think the more important issue here is this: do Jews have a reason to be skeptical of Western society? Because I read Mcdonald, I've spoken to him before, and I would love for, well, since McDonald is the one who proposed the theory, but I would love for him to flesh it out in a public sense for those who have not been reading his book. Because there's a scholar called David Nirenberg, and he has a book titled Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And Thomas Dalton recently published a book chronicling the challenges between Jews and Western civilization. So Jews have been in Western civilization for centuries and they have encountered discrimination. So basically, I do believe that they would have a reason to be skeptical of the West. What do you think about this argument?
Definitely, and as I mentioned, Jews are not the same as urban high IQ white Gentiles, and all groups are influenced by their history. How they're treated is influenced by their history, and the recent history of discrimination, I'm sure, has some influence over Jewish attitudes and behavior. But now there's a big jump from acknowledging that what I just said and saying Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy. Jews were a necessary condition for imposing liberal multiculturalism on the West. So I don't think that we should feel obligated if we acknowledge the obvious point that Jews have been influenced by their history of discrimination and maybe have some reason to be skeptical of, uh, say, white nationalist movements, uh, uh, that that therefore McDonald's thesis is correct, because that's he makes much more he makes very different claims.
Yeah, I think that well, I'm not McDonald, but I think that the thesis would be more interesting if we were actually tracing how Jewish people responded to discrimination over various centuries, because there's a big difference between saying Jews are the victims of discrimination, and because of this history, they respond by producing A values and arguing that Judaism is their group evolutionary strategy, and that there is a specific objective to undermine society. And I do believe that if the theory fixated more on Jews and their relationship to Western society and why they may have a reason to undermine it, people would respond to it differently.
Well, I mean, I would be just careful about what conclusions we draw from these observations. A history of discrimination will have some influence over some Jews sometime. The the question is, how much does that explain? And so in order, I mean, I don't dismiss McDonald's thesis a priori. I think the way to investigate it is to look at, to examine the evidence he presents. So it could be true. It could be that Jews were influenced to attack Western civilization for the reasons you mentioned. But was that a decisive force in Jewish political behavior? And I think an investigation suggests that it wasn't.
All right then, but it is still an issue that I will continue to research it. I'm researching it now. I wrote a short piece on the matter, and in the future I may write a longer piece, but I'm fascinated in how groups respond to discrimination. But let's talk about another issue still relating to McDonald's idea, but a different point. And you also address this matter in your various critiques. What about the argument that Jewish people have puppets to hide their interests in various groups? So McDonald contends that
Mhm.
the Gentiles responsible for multiculturalism and who are actively involved in Jewish organizations are actually the puppets of
Mm.
Jewish people.
Right, right. So McDonald has a problem. When you look at the leaders of these movements that he doesn't like, many of them are Gentiles. Many of the most influential liberal intellectuals have been Gentiles. But McDonald wants to pin the blame only on Jews. So what he does is, when there's a Jew leading the movement, of course, that's because of the group evolutionary strategy. The Jew is motivated by ethnocentrism. But what about when there's a Gentile? Well, the Gentile uh, was recruited by Jews and placed there to hide the Jewish character of the movement. So you can't. Um, so for McDonald, that I guess that makes sense, but that's a very questionable way of arguing, because now you have a bunch of Jews and Gentiles doing the same thing, and you're attributing certain motives to the Jews, and then have a kind of not very well supported theory about the Gentiles. I find that they're really being controlled by the Jews, and that therefore it's really all Jewish. I don't find that convincing.
And there's also the contention that Jews can make radical groups weaker. And the Occidental Observer, in a response, listed an academic, Stephen Beller, and they cite the example of Victor Adler and argue that in Europe, Jews who joined nationalist groups were often on the left, and they sought to undermine these movements. And for your own information, the piece is titled "The Cofnas Problem," part two of part three. So the response was delivered in part two.
Yeah. Um, I don't remember that specific example, but um, I mean, Andrew Joyce said said that gave some examples of
Yeah.
Jews
Victor
becoming
Adler and
involved in.
Heinrich
Yeah,
Friedrich,
yeah.
I don't speak German, but
Okay,
the
maybe those
writer,
are, I don't, maybe those
professor
were
is
the names.
Stephen
So
Beller. And Stephen
mm.
Beller, one of the foremost historians of the Jews of Central Europe during this period, described Adler as part of a Jewish intellectual grouping that possessed its own goals of social and cultural change.
And so, I mean, as Joyce himself says, when Jews got involved in nationalist movements, um, the uh, the Gentiles were unhappy about it, blamed the Jews um, for problems within the movement, and then ultimately banned Jews from participating at all. Uh, so, I mean, um, this is probably one of the reasons why Jews are underrepresented in nationalist movements is they tend to uh, become anti-Semitic. I mean, those movements just that Joyce mentioned just ban Jews completely. I don't know if uh, um, either Joyce or Mcdonald has ever provided evidence that Jews were systematically infiltrating nationalist movements in order to promote Jewish interests.
Well,
It's just
the evidence putatively cited here is by, well, not Stephen Beller. Stephen Beller is just the academic who wrote on the subject, but they cite Victor Adler and some of his acolytes.
look. I mean, we'd have to look in detail at the evidence for that. But I mean, by Joyce's own account, these movements ban Jews. So um, and the charges that were made against the Jewish nationalists that he doesn't like, or he didn't provide compelling evidence that
Yeah,
they were
so
correct or that
let,
these
let,
people
let,
were.
let, let me read something that may appear to be compelling. The eventual adoption of an iron clause by Austrian nationalists was a response to the dilution of nationalism promoted by Adler and their very Jewish social circles, as well as Jewish movement predecessors like Ignaz Kuranda and Moritz Hartmann.
So I don't. I would have to look at it in more detail in order to comment on the details. But uh, I mean, based on what Joyce says in the passage you just read, that's consistent with just people who don't like Jews participating in the nationalist movement, just complaining, raising the usual complaints about, uh, which are sometimes just imagined, uh, and then banning Jews from the movement. So,
Well,
and I
what
think
you may
the
go ahead.
point that nationalist movements are in Europe have frequently been anti-Semitic. And even when they don't start off anti-Semitic, they pretty quickly become anti-Semitic. Uh, I think that's a clearly true generalization.
Well, we are discussing a statement that is testable, and you are a scientist and philosopher, so I'm sure you or someone else can actually test what Joyce is saying by doing a meta-analysis to show how radical Jews often respond to the perceived infiltration of Jewish people. Sorry, not radical Jews, or radical groups respond to the perceived infiltration of Jews.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject for further investigation. I mean, I found with, I began with a critique of McDonald's most influential book, The Culture of Critique. because I thought that was the strongest case made for this, for the anti-Jewish position uh, associated with the alt-right and those kinds of ideologies. So my uh, my feeling was that if I examine the best case for that position and and find that it's problematic, then I wouldn't need to investigate uh, every other case that people have made for the same position, because I've already addressed the best arguments. Um, so it will never end. McDonald and Joyce can always go back through the last 1,000 years of history and find something. What about this? And doesn't this support our position? And then
Yeah.
we could go investigate the details for that. But um, I probably I'm not going to continue doing that forever. I
I
feel that
don't
I've
expect you
responded to
to.
the strongest arguments. So I think people can make a judgment about what's more convincing based on the issues that we've addressed so far.
Yeah, but Nathan, I like the debate between you and McDonald and some of his colleagues, because it is one, illuminating, and two, many of these theses can be tested. They are testable claims, and I think we should explore them. So, for example, remember I said earlier, McDonald's idea is really interesting, but some accuse him of being anti-Semitic, and that I said I don't impute intentions or motives to people. But if the debate was conducted in a less polemical manner, it would bear fruit, because it's really interesting.
Well, I never called. I never
I didn't say
called
that you call
McDonald
him
in that. Yeah,
anti-Semitic. I
yeah, of
didn't
course.
say that.
So yeah. Uh, Incidentally, um, my first paper, Judaism as a Group Evolutionary Strategy, which is published in Human Nature, one of the peer reviewers um, argued that I should conclude by saying McDonald is an anti-Semite. And clearly he's motivated by anti-Semitism. And, I was obviously I thought that was impossible. I couldn't, and that's ridiculous to, in an academic paper, you're arguing about the arguments and about the ideas, and to conclude by accusing the other person of anti-Semitism is not appropriate. So I refused to do that. As a compromise, I added something about McDonald shouldn't be taken to represent evolutionary psychology, something like that. And apparently the reviewer was satisfied by that. Yeah, most of McDonald's critics just responded by calling him an anti-Semite, uh, uh, which obviously didn't convince the people who are interested in McDonald's ideas that he was wrong, just because name calling isn't convincing. Now, is McDonald an anti-Semite? Maybe is a question that somebody could be interested in, although it's irrelevant to the correctness of his ideas. He himself has said that he doesn't like Jews, so I don't think he said that Jews are bad people, and certainly he publishes papers in the journals that he edits, the Occidental Observer, Occidental Quarterly, that are pretty openly anti-Semitic. So I don't know if he would object to that term, but that's obviously a separate question from whether or not Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy.
And arguing that Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy is not a moralistic claim any at all.
Um, not well, not necessarily. It can be presented in a neutral scientific way. Of course, if the neutral scientific theory attributes um, actions or character to Jews that has moral connotations, then it could have some at least implications that go uh, beyond science. But yeah, I mean the thesis is essentially a scientific thesis, so should be treated as such.
And this is exactly the problem, Nathan, because if, for example, let's say I'm arguing that Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy and I view Jewish people as variables, that is not a problem. But if it is persistently said or implied that Jews constitute a problematic group, then this is where we encounter a problem. So this,
Uh,
the theory has the potential to be scientific if one can discover evidence, but presently it is a bit political. I think that's my issue.
Yeah, McDonald himself is openly interested in the political implications of his theory. Uh, he said this quite openly that he had the theory, the scientific theory about Jewish behavior, Jewish evolution, and um, he believes this has implications for whites and white interests, and he engages in activism on behalf of white interests against what he sees as Jewish interests. So, uh, but when you debate the science, I think it's appropriate to make a clear separation between science and politics.
All right. And originally we're talking about Karl Marx, and this is the evidence cited to indicate that Marx was somewhat interested in preserving Jewish identity. Citing Jacob Katz, and as an owner of several volumes by Katz, I've checked for accuracy. Perhaps the foremost mainstream 20th century scholar of Jewish Christian relations between the medieval and modern periods. McDonald astutely qualified his summary of Marx's anti-Semitism by stressing that Marx argued against the idea that Jews must give up their Jewishness to be German citizens, and he envisioned that Judaism, freed from the principle of greed, would continue to exist in the transformed society after the revolution.
So this is Joyce, right?
Yes, and let me continue.
Joyce is making it up. McDonald acknowledged that he got the Cat's quote wrong. So it's it's already, this issue has already been resolved. McDonald admitted he's wrong. So Joyce, Joyce is counting on his readers just not investigating. They want to believe McDonald's position, so he can just make something up and they'll believe it, but it's just made up.
Yeah, but Jacob's cat, that's the scholar, and I didn't remember his name. So when I'm doing interviews, I like to give context. So if a scholar postulated a point, I like to cite him so that my own listeners can do their research. So I had to cite that information, although it was rushed before.
The reference to the made up Katz quote is in my original paper, Judaism as a Group Evolutionary Strategy, and McDonald admitted that he got it wrong. So
Yeah, all right then. But Nathan, and now we're treading on somewhat interesting ground. What about the argument that of all, and this is actually a fact, of all religious groups, Jews are the most liberal? This is often cited as evidence to support McDonald's assertions.
so Jews are disproportionately liberal as a group. McDonald's claim was about Jewish the intellectuals. Uh, I mean, he was explicitly not about the explaining Jewish, although sometimes he comments on Jewish behavior as the behavior of the population as a whole. But he is concerned with intellectual movements that exerted power, political influence. Um, so the question was whether about the leaders, Jewish leaders, influential Jews, uh, were they uh, acting in accordance with Jewish interests? Were they explicitly concerned with Jewish interests? The fact that Jews are more likely to vote Democrat is interesting and requires explanation. I'm sure that the recent history of persecution has played some role in Jewish liberalism, but that is not um, that doesn't directly support Mcdonald's thesis. And as I mentioned in the paper, The Anti-Jewish Narrative, if Jews voted Republican, first, Jews who are liberal Jews overwhelmingly vote Democrat. But Jews that actually care about Jewish interests, namely Orthodox Jews, they vote Republican. They voted for Trump. They're conservatives, right-wing extremists. So the evidence is that Jews who actually care about Jewish interests vote Republican and are conservative. And the Jews who have less of a connection with, or no connection at all with Judaism, are more likely to be liberal. But if secular Jews would vote Republican and be conservative, the alt-righters would say that that's just more proof of the Mcdonald kind of theory, because they say that the Republican Party is also controlled by Jews, just like the Democratic Party. So I think that argument is kind of disingenuous.
All right then, but Nathan, I haven't done enough research on the personality type of Jews as yet, and you also contended that it is something that you may be interested in exploring. But Jews, because Jews are intelligent, they can be disproportionately conservative, disproportionately liberal, or even libertarian. So many brilliant writers on in the libertarian and objectivist movements are Jews. So, for example, Ayn Rand was a Jew. Was a Jew. I'm a big fan of Paul Gottfried, someone who's very passionate about Western civilization, and he's also Jewish. So because they're intelligent, the pendulum can swing either way. But Jews seem, even when we're not discussing MacDonald or his acolytes, Jews seem to be particularly liberal. And I think this is something you could explore or comment on. So in a space where one is just writing about personality traits and differences based on religion or personality, Jews come across as particularly liberal.
Yeah, I mean, there are also quite a lot of Jews in non-anti-Semitic right-wing movements, and even white nationalist movements that were not anti-Semitic uh, have had quite a lot of Jewish participation until they inevitably become anti-Semitic. American Renaissance is the most notable example of that. Um, as I mentioned in the paper, 4 out of 10 of the invited speakers at the first American Renaissance conference were Jewish. And there was quite a lot of Jewish involvement in American Renaissance, which became less and less as the association with anti-Semites increased.
Uh,
Um,
well, you may continue, please.
I mean, part of Jewish political behavior might be explained by where they live, but they're still more liberal than uh, comparable Gentiles. Uh, that's an interesting question. That that will should be investigated. Uh, I think that the recent history of discrimination is playing some role. Uh, and just as with other groups, for example, gays are quite liberal. I believe more liberal than Jews are. Uh, there's no gay group evolutionary strategy, or uh, may not be the case that gays are even more disposed toward liberal, innately more disposed toward liberalism. It's just a response to some cultural forces. So yes, it should be investigated, but I think that's separate
Yes,
from the
yeah, that's what
claims that
that's my
McDonald
point.
is making.
It's a separate issue, and I like the conversation. I just wish it would have been a bit less political because we
Uh, yeah. I also I have the same wish. I wish that after my one of the goals of my paper, as I said explicitly, was I wanted to encourage people to study this Jewish behavior, Jewish overrepresentation, uh, and and to be able to do it and to investigate all possibilities without being accused of anti-Semitism or. But there was a backlash uh, sort of against my paper in some quarters. People thought that I had legitimized McDonald by taking his ideas seriously, and the journal was at fault for publishing the paper. And even though I was criticizing McDonald, still they were treating it as a serious possibility. I and the journal are treating his ideas as within the realm of legitimate discourse. So uh, I think it will be a while before this issue gets mainstream attention.
Nathan, you're a promising researcher. Clearly, I'm not rich yet, so I can't employ you to do research. But I think you should. It would be wise to play the game properly. But some people ought to be ignored. Kevin McDonald has written some interesting articles and books on family and its relationship to individualism. Personally, I do believe that even though I don't agree with some of his assumptions, he's an interesting scholar. That's my own opinion. And in the 90s, McDonald actually did a lot of.
I'm not. Could be.
Hello?
Yes.
Were you unable to hear me?
No, I heard you. I don't know. I haven't. I'm not very familiar with his other work
Yeah,
outside
yeah. So
Judaism, so
in the
I can't
90s,
comment on it.
McDonald wrote some interesting papers on evolutionary psychology, and he's interested in group dynamics and selection and the nuclear family and its relationship to the rise of the West. And I'm interested in capitalism and the family. So I tend to follow some of his books closely.
It could be. I think that um, history would have been better if people had engaged with McDonald in a intellectually responsible way in the early days, uh, because people just critics just dismissed him as an anti-Semite, and there was really no one um, really critically examined his ideas, and he didn't have any. There was nothing pushing him to maybe make revisions or reconsider some things. So in the way science usually works, somebody proposes a hypothesis, an ambitious hypothesis. People find some problems with it. They modify you, you have to, it has to be modified. Uh, but that didn't happen. So, McDonald just um, sort of became quite dogmatic about defending these ideas, never dismissing critics as having bad motives. Uh, and I think maybe that made it very difficult um, for for everyone to discuss this rationally.
Yeah, but Kevin McDonald's thesis, Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy, is quite extensive, and we're at the last lap. We're going to talk about ethnocentrism. Other than McDonald's, some scholars do contend that Jews demonstrate higher levels of in-group favoritism. And these arguments are separate from McDonald. Can Are you in a position to provide an explanation as to why Jews would be more ethnocentric?
Um, I think that there isn't really compelling evidence that Jews are innately more ethnocentric than other people. So uh, I, uh, I would object to the. And with regard to race differences in ethnocentrism, clearly ethnocentrism is highly sensitive to the environment. Uh, I mean, if we were having this conversation 90 years ago, we would think that Germans are clearly the most ethnocentric people in the world. And now, uh, but because if we're having the conversation in 2021, we would say that they're the least ethnocentric people in the world. Well, the genes haven't changed significantly. It's just um, this is not a stable trait, and race differences in ethnocentrism are clearly not stable at all. So to take one moment in time and make a claim, which isn't really well supported anyway, that Jews are more ethnocentric and therefore it's innate, uh, I don't think that's a correct inference.
Well, I agree with you that to an extent it may be contextual, but look at Germany, for example. If Germans were, let's say, more ethnocentric 100 or 150 years ago, there is actually not real concrete evidence today to suggest that they're not ethnocentric. Maybe the Germans are pro immigration because it is the politically opportune thing to do. And this is a problem with with debates of this nature. We can never get into people's head.
You got cut off for a sec. You said maybe Germans are
No,
pro-immigration.
no, I was saying that even though today Germans seem to be pro-immigration, a problem with these debates is that we can never get into people's head. So I could be very ethnocentric, but for political reasons, I associate with non-blacks. So you can't. It's a bit subjective.
Then maybe it would be interesting to speculate about these things, but drawing conclusions, uh, we're not in a position to really make those judgments. Doesn't seem like I, I I I think we should be very cautious about
Yeah,
that.
but for readers can always consult Duton and Dunkel. They have produced some papers on the topic.
Right. Um, I mean, they ask uh, different groups some questions about who would you like to associate with, who would you marry somebody from a different group. Now there was a Christian group that had exactly the same scores as Jews, but I guess they don't highlight that fact. Uh,
Mm.
you know, race differences in ethnocentrism, or the clearly race, it's highly sent the trait is highly sensitive to the environment. There's a pretty obvious explanation why Jews might exhibit uh, slightly higher ethnocentrism than white Gentiles in surveys, namely because in contemporary America, namely uh, everyone is all minorities are encouraged to be proud of their minority status. So, and white uh, expressions of white pride are extremely taboo. So, Jews wouldn't say they're proud to be white or only associate with whites, but there would be um, less pressure against saying that they prefer, or there maybe be some encouragement to say that they are proud to be Jewish. I don't think that and this is very meaningful. And as I mentioned, Jews have um, the highest intermarriage rate of any religious group in the United States. Now, Kevin McDonald has made exactly one testable prediction in his trilogy. He said that intermarriage rates in the Jewish community would go down as they found the community would put up barriers to intermarriage and preserve their racial. That prediction was incorrect, and McDonald has acknowledged that he got the prediction wrong. So, okay, so now after the fact, some defenders of McDonald have come up with arguments for why uh, intermarriage rates actually are irrelevant, or maybe uh, it actually supports McDonald's thesis. But uh, the trend did not go the way McDonald predicted.
Okay. But Nathan, this is one issue where I will proudly side with your critics, and let me tell you why. Intermarriage is not a good proxy for levels of ethnocentrism. So, for example, during slavery in Jamaica and America, white men had sexual relationships with black women, even though they were racist, and their children often identified as white, and they even owned slaves. So if Johnny decides to marry a Chinese woman, that does not mean that he's not ethnocentric. So I don't
Yes, but
think that
I think
intermarriage is a good proxy.
having sex with a concubine is different from marriage.
Yeah, but some of them had long-term partnerships with these women, and when they died, their children inherited the estate. But marrying someone outside of your race is not a good proxy for tolerance.
But
It is not.
how do you know those people were ethnocentric? Maybe they weren't ethnocentric.
Based
They
on right,
benefited from slavery. So, but maybe they just didn't care. They just is there evidence that they
based on
actually
right, yes,
cared
based
about
on
them more?
writings and descriptions. But at that time, they would not have been using the word a lot. But I could marry to a white or a Chinese woman and insist that my children should be raised Christian or speak Jamaican patois. Marrying outside of your race is not. I don't believe that is a good proxy for tolerance.
Hmm.
And we will agree to differ.
I'll just say that you cited some of my critics on this issue is Dutton
Yeah.
and what's his name, Dutton and
Yeah, Dutton and Dunkel did the paper on Jews and
right.
ethnocentrism, and
So
Dunkel did
one of
no,
their
sorry, Dutton did a
mm,
separate paper on marriages.
um, so Dutton invented or the scale that Dutton used to measure ethnocentrism.
Okay.
So according to my critic, uh, the desire to marry someone in your own group is a measure of ethnocentrism.
Nathan?
Yes.
Yeah, just repeat yourself for a minute. You are breaking up.
So one of the questions that Dutton used to measure ethnocentrism asked people about how committed they are to marry someone in their own group. So according to my critics, the desire to marry someone in your own group is a measure of ethnocentrism.
Yes, yes, your critics are right in that regard. People who are ethnocentric are more likely to marry within the group, but at the same time, you may marry outside of your group for political and economic reasons. So, for example, Johnny may just like one specific woman of Chinese descent, and he's still anti-Asian. You get the point. Marrying outside of your group doesn't really mean that you're tolerant. I'm sorry, but I'm
It's
not convinced yet that intermarriage can be a true proxy. And then even you said in one of your pieces that when people marry to Jews, they often convert or change some of their culture. I've read several of your articles, and you said something to that effect.
that's true.
Yeah,
That
but
many they undergo nominal
yeah,
form
conversion.
conversions. Yeah.
But you
Yes.
know, I this issue is complicated, but I am for this particular point, I'm more impressed by your critics to an extent, but I've never seen, as especially as a student of history, I've never seen intermarriage as a proxy for tolerance. People marry outside of their race all the
Mm.
time for a million and one reasons.
Yeah, well, I would just emphasize that Kevin McDonald, when I was 11 years old, before I was involved in any of these debates, Kevin McDonald predicted that Jewish intermarriage would go down, and in fact, it went up. So, if I think it's reasonable um, to to judge a theory in part by whether it makes successful predictions.
Mm.
So at least with respect to that issue, and well, that was actually the only issue about which McDonald made a prediction and the prediction was wrong.
Was
So
wrong.
I would suggest that it counts against the theory. Okay, now there's another argument that maybe intermarriage uh, is different, has different implications from how what McDonald originally argued. Uh, I don't think intermarriage is inconsistent with ethnocentrism, but widespread intermarriage that is leading to the dissolution, leading the whole community to dissolve. I mean, Jewish intermarriage among secular Jews is well over 50%. And with low fertility. So the secular Jewish population is just disappearing. Um, it's not obvious how that uh, could be. That creates a problem, I think, for the person who says Jews are highly ethnocentric. But
It
it's still
depends on how
possible.
you analyze it. So, for example, Jude being a Jew is a religion and also a philosophy. Jewish people, irrespective of their commitment to their religion, know about Judaism, and they also have appreciation for non Jewish practices and religion. So again, we can boil it down back to their levels of intelligence. So I think the significant factor in this discussion is intelligence. Intelligent people are more open to ideas. They're more likely to take risk. They're more likely to not conform, etc. So I think there's a nexus between intelligence, ethnocentrism, and Jewish practices more broadly.
Well, yeah, I know
Yeah.
in your article you linked to a survey that suggested Jews are more knowledgeable than non-Jews about all religions, um, including Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism. So, I mean,
But hold on, let me make a final point. And remember, if Jews, the average, whether we want to believe it or not, most of us have a preference for the in group. This is the norm. So even though interracial marriages are increasing, the average black person will marry to a black person, the average white will marry to a white person. But Jews are unusually intelligent, and intelligent people make different choices. So maybe they're more likely to marry outside of their race because this is a function of intelligence and openness to ideas and differences. That could also be an issue.
Uh, that sounds reasonable. I'm sure
Yeah.
there are many factors at play that influence Jews to marry each other and maybe influence Jews to marry out. But I don't think anything that we see uh, provides strong evidence that Jews are innately highly ethnocentric.
And the last point on the topic is, and you can either respond or not respond because we're wrapping up, but the last point on the topic is that Jewish marriages to non-Jews, Gentiles, tend to be unstable. And Duton cited a study. This is not one of the arguments that I am pushing forward. My argument is that intermarriage is not a proxy for ethnocentrism. So when I include this argument, you're responding to your critics and not necessarily me. But yes, this is another contention that marriages between Jews and Gentiles are not stable. I haven't looked into the issue thoroughly.
Uh,
Yeah.
I'd have to examine it more carefully, but if I remember correctly, there was a he claimed there was a small difference in the percentage chance of ending in divorce, whether the marriage was between Jews or a Jew and a Gentile. It was not, and he drew very far-reaching conclusions on the basis of a pretty small difference. Now, why would mixed marriages have been more likely to end in divorce in that sample? I would have to look in detail at the study and make a determination. But that and there are many possible explanations. We'd have to look into that. I don't think that simply presenting that statistic proves what Dutton claims.
Yeah, I'm going to revisit the article and look at the studies, but this is not an issue that I examined thoroughly, so I won't give an opinion. But Nathan, I enjoy speaking to you, and originally I wanted to briefly discuss racial differences in intelligence. You wrote an article for a philosophical magazine, but I've touched this issue before with other people, so I'm just going to wrap up. Maybe
Okay.
another time we can have this conversation. But before
Yeah.
I go, I will ask a question. Is race a useful biological construct?
When properly defined, um, of course, the critics of race have many straw man definitions of it. Uh, the lay concept of race might not um, align perfectly with biological reality, but there is a biological basis to race, in my
All
view.
right, and racial differences in personality and intelligence do exist. So, all right, it was a pleasure to speak to you, and maybe I should invite you another time to have this discussion.
Yes, good to talk to you.
All
Thank
right
you
then,
for
bye.
having me.